Welcome to the Stetzer ChurchLeaders Podcast, where we're helping Christian leaders navigate and lead through the cultural issues of our day. My name's Daniel Jahng, the director of the Church Multiplication Institute, and today we're talking with Jahng. Kenny's an entrepreneur, strategic advisor, and former pastor. He's the editor-in-chief of ChurchTechToday.com, founder of AI4ChurchLeaders.com, and then founder of Big Click Syndicate, a strategic marketing advisory firm helping Christian leaders build marketing engines that work. Joining Ed in this week's conversation is Steele Billings. Steele's a technologist who currently leads Glue's AI in the Church initiative, which includes a $25 million fund that invests in faith-driven organizations, leading research and development around the responsible use of AI in ministry. Before we talk to Kenny, we want to remind you that if you're enjoying our interviews, it would help us if you left us a review. Now let's go to Ed Stetzer, editor-in-chief of Outreach Magazine and the dean of the Talbot School of Theology.
All right, well, as you heard already, Steele Billings is going to be partnering with me in this. And part of the reason is that if we're going to have a conversation about AI, we want to have people who actually know, thinking about engaging in the space around AI. And so Steele's actually leading Glue. Some of you know that I do some work with Glue, and Glue has an AI initiative as well. If you go to glue.us/AI, you'll be able to find it there. There's all kinds of stuff going on there. We'll be together, depending on when you listen to this. So we'll go into a hackathon. We've got all kinds of resources, the AI and the Church Hub, all there. Again, glue.us/AI. But Steele, I'm super glad you're here. And our guest today, of course, is Kenny Jahng. And Kenny, I'm going to actually ask you to explain a bit of what you do, because a traditional bio probably doesn't line up, because really you're in this space a little differently. So let's start with Kenny, because I know about the AI. I've joined the AI for church leaders and pastors. I know you've done online summits. Tell me more about what you're doing, what your role is, and what you're doing in AI.
Yeah, one of the things that I love doing is trying to bring marketplace best practices to ministry. And so over the years, I've been exploring different technologies and different best practices and really teaching churches and ministries how to take advantage of that. So AI is this next thing that has come of age, right? Generative AI came on and exploded on the scene for the mass public in November when ChatGPT came out. And so it's just one of those things that we are starting to educate, build training resources, and really help ministries maximize it and use technology to scale personal relationships. At the end of the day, that's what the whole promise of AI is, I think, is that AI is going to help ministries scale personal relationships with technology.
Okay, so, and we want to talk about some of how and what that looks like. So Steele, I want to come to you and jump into the conversation a little bit, because I think for a lot of people, the idea of AI is, was suddenly, Cyberdyne comes alert, and now we've got, self-aware robots, and here we end up in Terminator. So, but there's a whole, it's not, AI didn't start to exist when large language models were released to the general public. So tell us a little bit about that beforehand.
Well, AI has been around for many, many years, right? The conversations around artificial intelligence, and I believe even the term artificial intelligence was coined in the 50s by a group of scientists and educators. And so, fast forward to the early 2000s, and it's being used largely under the terms of things like machine learning and, ultimately processing very large data sets. And so, when we are, Glue, for example, has been using artificial intelligence, and we've been doing machine learning research and development for several years, and understanding how can we help it advance conversations that lead to deeper connections between humans and between God. That's just something that we've been doing. So now we're getting into the generative AI side, and it's really exploded with the launch of ChatGPT last November, and now it's hit mainstream.
Yeah, now I want folks listening to stay with us, because really we're going to talk about some ways that are very practical to use AI. And in subsequent episodes, we're going to talk about kind of some challenges that come around with that. You already mentioned, Steele, large language models. And again, that's a phrase that some people may have heard, but a little less common is that discussion. What are large language models, and why do they matter?
Well, large language models are really the brains of many of these AI tools that maybe you're using right now, like ChatGPT or Google Bard. They thrive off of a large language model, and a large language model is it's a very complex system that looks at billions of parameters. At least the largest ones do. And when I say parameter, it's often a word or some sort of keyword. It's some sort of information that it's been given, like books or videos that it transcribes, or downloads of the internet in ChatGPT's sense. OpenAI, for example, is made up of 60% of it comes from a download of the internet as of September 2021. The other 40% is made up of it consuming millions and millions of books and text, comes from downloads of threads from things like Wikipedia. And so it builds this information. And the difference between the internet as we know it, right, a collection of information, and now artificial intelligence, is that artificial intelligence trains itself. It's constantly evolving, it's constantly improving, and it is taught to get smarter as it goes. Yeah, so Kenny, the basics of AI, there's a few different types of AI. Can you explain what those different types of AI and why do they matter?
Yeah, I think for a lot of the audience here, AI just is confusing and it's intimidating, right? It feels like you need like a white lab coat or a PhD to really understand what it is. As you said before, we've had AI baked into our lives for years and years and years, whether you've already been using GPS or Google autocomplete in searches, or Netflix queue, or an Amazon recommendation feed, right? Like that, all that stuff is AI behind the scenes. And what this latest version, which we're calling generative AI, is basically taking all that brainiac AI, machine learning, and then adding on top of that a layer called natural language processing. So if you wanted to basically think of it from a Cliff Notes point of view, it's all this crazy, high-tech stuff, machine learning, and then adding this layer of natural language processing. And what that does is completely unlocks access to this AI technology for the masses. Meaning now, instead of having to learn code or, again, be a nerd, you really could just use plain English language or any other language and talk to the machine as if you and I are in Starbucks and asking a question. And what it would do is it will translate that natural language that you give it, and then goes off and does its brainiac thing with machine learning and all the other types of AI, and then comes back, and here's the kicker, it translates it back into natural language processing. And that's what makes it accessible. And what's so interesting about this development, this innovation front that we're calling generative AI, is it's not industry specific. It's not just for accountants. It's not just for law. It is something that anybody that's using text or language, which is pretty much every industry, every niche, every genre out there, is now applicable in terms of trying to figure out how do we use this technology in our work, in our lives. And so this is why it has been all over the news, and we're seeing it more and more, that it's becoming pervasive everywhere we go.
Yeah, and with a lot of the news comes a little bit of a escalation and alarm. We're going to talk about that. We do have there are ethical considerations and concerns, but there are also opportunities here. And I'll give just an example. So just yesterday, I was recording just in the time we were recording these episodes. I was recording an interview with Francis Chan. And so I know that there must be 2021. There must be a vast amount of knowledge about Francis Chan out there. I've got plenty of interviews or books that I've written that will be out there. So I typed in, I said, first I told it to basically pretend you're Ed Stetzer, which is an important thing because it helps to frame how AI is going to explain some of these things. And then I said, Ed Stetzer is going to interview Francis Chan for his new book, Until Unity. What questions should Ed Stetzer ask? So it's a very, very specific series of queries. And then it gave me, and I used 2 of them, but it gave me 10 questions that really, let me give you an example. Some of you know my last book was called, talks about Christians in the Age of Outrage. So question 4 is, in a world marked by division and polarization, well, wait a second, that certainly comes from Ed Stetzer idea. Well, I'm sure others at Francis Chan have as well. How can the church be a witness for unity and reconciliation? And what role does humility play in promoting unity among believers? Well, if you've read the book, that's a key part of it. So it's basically tying these together. And that's one of 10, I would say 8 of them were all good questions. So when we see something like that, we're like, okay, well, what does this mean for us as ministry opportunities. And we can see use is a possibility, but why is responsible use? Because I've also typed in, just see what it'll do, write me a sermon for Philippians chapter 2, 9 through 11. And I will tell you, it was a surprisingly good sermon for Philippians chapter 2, verses 9 through 11, but I wouldn't use or do that. So anyway, so why is responsible use so important? We'll start first with Kenny.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where we have to recognize where we are on this innovation front. And we are at the very, 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 very tip. And we are all early adopters. This AI technology hallucinates, as we say. It doesn't actually give back factual information all the time. Sometimes it's off, sometimes it's wrong, and it says it with confidence. There are all these things that don't work as if it's like an Apple experience, right? It's just still janky a lot of times. Just like you said, the sermon that you asked it to write came back, it's not really something that you would take to the pulpit immediately.
No,
right?
Actually, I would say the sermon was good. I wouldn't ethically take it to the pulpit immediately. The sermon was good. It did, when I asked for some quotes, it did quote J.D. Greer as me, which was interesting. I texted J.D. and said, "I'm you now," and he was quite a frightening moment with him. But there are consistently things like quotes. I would never take a quote from AI as a quote that's accurate without additional information. But keep going.
Yeah, so that's called a hallucination, right? Like it's basically, if you look at what the technology is, it is not a concept engine. It is really a large language model. And the way, if you want to nerd out just for a second there, the way it comes up with the responses is not that it goes off and researches it, figures out the concept, and tries to explain it back to you. What is actually happening with these large language models, with generative AI, is it goes off with your query. It checks this database of millions of data points of language that it is scraped, like Steele said. It's like all of Wikipedia and Reddit threads and the internet and databases, right? It takes all of that and then just does predictive analysis word by word. So it takes one word and then tries to figure out what actually would be the next best word in the sentence that I should actually bring back. Takes the second word, goes back to the database, does its machine learning, comes back with a third word, then comes back to the database, and it goes back and forth. So it literally doesn't know the end of the sentence when it first starts the sentence.
Fascinating.
And that's how hallucinations happen, because for some reason, JD's quotes, the attribution was near, probably on the page somewhere, to where it should have been attributed to you, but his name was on the page in many places, right? There's some proximity of the data. So that's one of those things why we need to start to think through how we actually use the data that comes out of it. And the default posture typically is, hey, this looks good, let's run with it. And that's where this ethics and the responsible use, I think, has to come into play. I advocate that every single ministry, every organization really needs to start to think of, we need to have an AI policy. Whether you embrace AI, whether you're skeptical of it, whether you're fearful of it, you need an AI policy, because here's the number one takeaway right now. No matter what you feel about AI as a leader, your teams, your organization, there are people using it right now. Whether you know or not, there are people on your teams, in your organization, using AI for their work right now. And if you don't have a policy, then how are you going to actually, even from the liability perspective, Ed, right? Like executive pastors, they're the ones who are probably going to freak out on this podcast right now. Think from a liability standpoint of what's going to happen if people on your staff or your volunteers put sensitive data about people in your congregation into the machine, and that the terms of service of many of these chatbots are able to legally take anything that you put into it, incorporate it into the database, and then who knows where that might surface years from now. And so those are the types of things where, just from a legal standpoint, defensive standpoint, you need an AI policy just to start to wrestle with how we use it responsibly within our organization.
So Kenny, I mean, you mentioned hallucinations as one of the things that we should watch out for or be aware of with AI. I mean, let's get practical a little bit for church leaders. What are some of these dangers, and what can they lead to? You talked about misquoting. But maybe this will help us get to that question of, if I'm a church leader right now and I just heard you talk about a privacy policy or a policy around AI,
Yeah.
where do I start? What are the things I need to address in that policy?
Yeah, so I think the first common one that I think everyone could, grab and get a handle on is attribution, right? So it's one of those things where just Ed was saying, hey, I wouldn't take that sermon, because many pastors will probably take AI generated sermons as is and pass it off as their own. And attribution is one of those things. Transparency is the concept that your team has to struggle with, that says, how transparent are we? Where does the attribution happen? Do you have to mention that you use AI in every single piece that you publish? I would say down the line, very soon, AI is going to be normalized in all of our work. Pastors currently use commentaries. They use Logos software. They use Google. Do you actually provide attribution that you used these specific commentaries or resources every time you preach? No, right? But we're not there yet right now as a culture. And so until we get to the point where it's normalized and everyone has a good understanding of what it actually is, attribution, transparency is just one of those things that I think is really important for leaders to really wrestle with.
Be transparent about who's creating the content.
Yeah, and I think it's the question of how, right? Because it's not just binary, oh, we're going to be transparent or we're not going to be transparent. It's how you talk about it, how you actually give attribution, when do you give attribution, where in the process is it okay to use it, where is it not?
It's good. And you said earlier, not use the phrase passed it off as their own. I think that's really key. Now again, I'm actually I said I wouldn't have AI write a sermon for me. I do think there are places where people can use, and have been doing for a long time, that bivocational pastor who has 5 hours a week to do all the ministry that's there, and that pastor preaches so-and-so's sermon outlines and tells people that, I'm a bivocational pastor. Listen, so we're working through Charles Stanley's sermon series on so-and-so. Great. There might be some uses like that where there's you indicate what's going on. I think the challenge is that we don't want people basically plagiarizing, in a sense, AI, the way they might plagiarize someone else's sermon. If you are a staff member of a church and your church is assuming and has brought you into this team to study God's word and to bring forward God's word, that needs to be your ethical approach. Now, I say here, though, that this can become an amazing research tool and research partner. And for example, I'm actually doing a sermon at Mariners, a message at Mariners Church where I serve on. We're doing every January, we kind of do this series called On the Table, tough issues. And my tough issue is basically the Christian faith, Christianity, and science. And so I'm just looking at my Chat GPT history right here. And I said, what Bible verses help us to understand the relationship between faith and science? And then boom, 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 boom. So and they're the verses I would have used. So, but then I complained. I said, what translation did you use? And it says, I apologize for not specifying the translation. I used NIV. So, and I forgave it. I think it's good to teach AI to be forgiving. And so, but the point is you're using these things as researchers. And I think that's a distinction. I used it for research in Francis Chan questions. I used it for research in what are some lists of verses that are there. But we're just scratching the surface of the things that you can do as well. And one of the things that seems to be super important is that AI is not, and Steele, you talk a little bit about this. So talk about a little bit about AI should support, not replace relationships, because I'm just talking about sermon research. But there's a lot of other places, and relationships could be pushed aside. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, I mean, so Kenny highlighted a really big issue with AI, and that is the hallucinations. There's several other potential issues, and we've heard folks talking about the idea that how do I trust where the information comes from? And so that goes back to the corporate alignment issues around artificial intelligence and the fact that there are corporations building these large language models behind this technology. And you have to ask, what are some of their alignment desires that they might be implementing into the technology, even though they're not. They say that they're not. And so OpenAI and Google and Microsoft, you've got to question those things. That's the technological side of it. But what about just the human nature aspects of it, where we might start to use artificial intelligence as a crutch? And that crutch might lead us to a place where it starts to disintermediate relationship and actually becomes the barrier in between us growing in relationship with God and with one another, that's a real risk. And so at Glue, we've have launched this entire initiative around artificial intelligence called AI in the church. And the core principle there, one, is we believe it's a moral imperative for us to start to advance the ability for us to better understand artificial intelligence from a faith perspective, start to put it to use, explore the possible uses. But the line that we do not cross is that artificial intelligence is never about replacing relationship. It's only about further enabling relationship to happen.
Yeah, and I think this is important because I think Kenny, I heard you say somewhere, maybe it was someone else quoting you, or maybe it was someone else, not you. But the church was really wary of the World Wide Web for a decade. It took a decade really for the church to engage some of that. I had our first web page up in a church in the mid '90s, and we made the newspaper. We were the first church in the town with a website. Now it's unheard of, but the websites were around before that. So there are kind of two ways to think of this. Really, an uncritical embrace of technology can really not serve the church well. But being 10 years late to what probably is a significant new generation of technology, man, I want people of faith in that conversation. Why is that important?
Yeah, I mean, right now, I think we're feeling that pressure, Ed, because I like to say that tech innovation right now is like dog years. When I used to be a partner in a .com venture catalyst, like an incubator, we were dealing with startups, and we used to always joke at the time that we are living dog years, that there's 7 leaps of innovation within a calendar year. And it feels like if I'm away from the computer, even for an afternoon, I come back and there's some new news in AI that has come up and has leapfrogged what we had before. So I think that's the pressure. And we feel also on top of that, FOLO, FOLO is the new word of the day. It's fear of looming obsolescence, right? We fear that the machine is going to take our jobs, and it's going to take our livelihood, and it's going to take over all of us.
Have you not seen The Matrix? Do you not know how this ends?
Right? And so this is one of those things where it's not a job ender, it's a job evolver. And
Well, but let's be fair. It's going to be a job ender for some people. I mean, there are people whose what they used to do is not going to be done anymore. It's going to be done by machine. So, But I agree with you. I mean, but at the same time, we can look back 100 years ago, and people who were making wagon wheels would be very upset that there was a new technology that used auto tires. And so the reality is, so how do we help serve people? And those bigger ethical implications we're going to address, particularly in the next episode. But so what then if it's good for us to lean in, which we're actually having this conversation right here because I think it's good for us to lean in. I also would like to see the church not just contribute, but to actually help lead the conversation around the responsible use of AI. So why don't you both weigh in on that? Kenny, you first. And then too, I want you to steal, when you respond after Kenny, I want you to share a little bit about how Glue is trying to put some guardrails around that. I should say too, Kenny and I are both working with Glue in this thing as well. So we're all one happy collaborative trying to help the church. But so Kenny, you first. How can we be involved to contribute and even lead the conversation on responsible use?
Yeah, I think the question I got the other day was, why is the church involved in AI, or why do you want the church to actually have a voice in this conversation? I think it's really, at the end of the day, you got to look at AI is not this technology that competes with humanity. AI is a mirror, right? Basically, it's reflecting both the brilliance and the bias of the creators. And if we're not embracing what AI has to offer and just trying to play it safe, we're stalling the future. And I think it's really easy if you are in a growth mindset and really understand, hey, the church has a space and a voice here for us to understand human flourishing at its core, that we are able to then move from intimidation to innovation pretty quickly. And I think, again, it's one of those things where the church has a worldview of what our purpose is and what the direction that we can help bring culture, society, and people that don't know Jesus Christ into a place that is a much better experience for them here as well as in eternity. I think this is just one of those things that we need to figure out. How do we use AI not to replace the human touch, but to amplify all of human potential?
I think that's good. Human flourishing is a really important part, Kenny. That's a fascinating aspect that you brought up. So at Glue, one of the things that we are putting in place is this idea around these working groups that are spinning up as we speak. Both of you are involved in some aspect with those working groups, but they're working groups around artificial intelligence, around legal and privacy, around technology, around theology, and how do we pull those working groups together underneath an umbrella that is being referred to as the Trust Council. And that Trust Council is meant to solve some of these bigger questions around the ethical and moral applications of artificial intelligence. And, one of the outcomes of this Trust Council will be things like documentation, will be certifications, but it's a set of standards that these technologies can adhere to. And we hope that that Trust Council doesn't just influence faith-driven technologists, but that it would influence technologists all around the world in all sectors of business and in life, from Silicon Valley to Singapore to China to Russia, that it would influence those things. And so we believe it's a moral imperative that the church has to be present in those conversations. And there's really two things that we're solving for. And it is, one, how can we advance education and capabilities for the church leader to be able to use artificial intelligence in all the ways that God has destined for it to be used, and help the church leaders just really level up in their understanding. And then part two of that is to bring faith to the center of the conversation around artificial intelligence, because it's a really unique opportunity that the church has in this moment to enter the chat, if you will, globally with these technologists and say, hey, you're asking questions about human existence. I mean, we haven't even talked about this fundamental idea of transhumanism, where scientists are trying to define intellect as the ever existent being, and humans are actually one day going to be extinct, but intelligence will continue on. And artificial intelligence has been a catalyst to that conversation. We get to enter the conversation and say, actually, we believe that the Bible has something to say about this, and that we were created in the image of God, and there's a source of intelligence, there's a source of wisdom, and it's a huge opportunity for the church to be in that conversation.
Yeah, and of course, we did a survey, and the survey came out of Glue and lots of partners. Kenny was one of the partners, and it's what's called a snowball survey. For those of you, we don't have time to unpack all of how the methodology works. Basically, people share it with people who share it with people, and people take it and eventually get hundreds and then thousands of people, and it frames out some of the ideas. And some of the data that came back I thought was interesting, and we'll release the full report as well. But how frequently do you use AI in the work you do for your church? The largest answer in the 40s is never. Rarely goes there as well. So when you get never and rarely, that's the majority of people. There are people who do it. If you do daily and weekly together, there's about 20% who are doing it sometime, either daily or weekly. For me, I'm probably between those two things. So, but it is interesting how quickly now you're up to, you're one of 4, 1 in 5 people. If, this is mainly geared towards pastors and staff, are engaging in AI regularly. That's an important and significant idea. Also, too, how much training would you need in order to effectively integrate AI? That's a big theme that comes up. Matter of fact, the largest answer there, more than a third, is quite a bit. I need a whole lot of training, in order to effectively, go, and that comes with different levels. So, and there's some level of concern, and I think rightful concern. When you look at to what extent are you concerned about the ethical or moral issues related to AI, we find that the highest answer, the plurality, it's under 30%, but around 30%, they're extremely concerned. About a quarter are quite concerned, and then somewhat concerned, and then slightly concerned, and there's a handful of people who are not at all concerned. So here's the deal. Everybody's concerned about this. And I really want to get to, in this episode, some of the practical things you can learn, but also want to say to you, Kenny and Steele, and I'm just, I'm along for the ride, helping learn, but you guys are already way ahead in some of these conversations. How are we going to be able to, you already talked about the Trust Council, but the Trust Council doesn't mean, that we're going to be able to give everyone good direction. We want to help church and church leaders use AI ethically and well, and that's part of what we're committed to. But there's a whole lot of concerns out there. So how do you walk through those concerns and help people to see the positive use?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we all have to do is start conversations. So it's not one of those things where the executive committee or the leader, the CEO of an organization goes off and figures out what the solution is and comes back and decrees it for the organization. you have to have conversations. Now, Carrie Newhoff and I, we wrote a piece recently that he published on his site talking about like what are the core ideas that you need to start to popularize and talk about within your teams. And one of them was the ethical considerations, all those expectations, right? And then it's like what you said before, like what's the impact on my job, on my role? Is there a future? How is it going to actually either diminish my value to the organization or increase it? And how do you strengthen specifically ministry workflows and the outcomes that we all want as objectives? And then there's even soft topics like how does it affect your mental health? Like that FOLO concept that we were talking about, the fear of looming obsolescence. That's a real thing, as you note, in that the majority hasn't actively used this on a daily basis yet. So they're just using preconceived notions that we all have learned about AI and sentient beings from science fiction, right? The Terminator. And that's what we know about AI. And so I think those are the types of things that we need to start to have conversations internally with all of our teams, all of our staff, our key volunteers, all the stakeholders to really start to surface what are their concerns, what are they seeing, and then really try to be practical about how do we address those and how do we educate? There's a really big education need right now across the board, across all levels of the organization, across all segments of your community.
Okay, so some quick questions kind of predicated with one as well. A lot of the things that we keep talking about ethical concerns, and the ethical concerns that I've largely framed around issues of plagiarism, things of that sort, hallucinations. I'd also say too that we have to address, though not in our conversation today, I mean, the ethical concerns of AI and military use, autonomous weapons and things of that sort. And we're going to talk a little bit more of that in subsequent episodes. We're going to focus more as we kind of come to the conclusion here. But there are huge ethical concerns all around. But the ethical concerns in church and ministry would be, do we participate in that if it has other ramifications? Well, if we're using Google, it's got all kinds of ramifications. So let's talk some about the ministry leaders using AI today. So Kenny, kind of a little bit of a rapid fire, just take us through how can ministry leaders use AI today? What are some ways today they could start using it?
Yeah, I think there's categorically a couple of large buckets that you can think about. So one is, because it's a language model, communications is a category of work that many leaders can immediately see benefits from, whether it's helping you to write emails, social media, newsletters, all those types of content pieces that you're writing. The second bucket I would say is research, like you mentioned, brainstorming, summarizing content, going off and refining things for you, learning things. The best metaphor that I can say to teams that I'm coaching right now is think of AI as a fresh, young seminary student intern, someone who hasn't worked on your staff. Maybe they just got there, they're new for the summer internship program or something like that. They're intelligent, but they're not fully trustworthy. And again, just like that sermon example, you wouldn't assign a seminary student intern to write your sermon and then without reviewing it, go off and preach it on Sunday. You would always want yourself in the loop and you would give feedback, right? And you would have a conversation and redirect the intern to say, no, you use this type of commentary. Theologically, our church follows this direction. Why don't you go back and try it with these other sources? You would refine it. You would say, hey, I didn't like what you did here. I liked what you did here. Go amplify and expand on this. Why don't you try to come up with new brainstorming topics based on research there? A seminary student intern relationship with this conversational chatbot is something that research is something that's going to be very fruitful for people. On a strategic basis, analysis and organizing information, data manipulation, planning projects, reorganizing content, pattern recognition. Those are the types of things that I think has so much potential that hasn't been tapped yet. And you're going to see a lot more tools and resources and workflows coming out that pastors, executive pastors are going to want to learn. Recently, I was just working with a church leader where we said, why don't we look at the giving data of all your people and then look at patterns and try to identify pretty quickly people that have been giving consistently and all of a sudden stopped giving, right? What happened there? So either one of your sermon really ticked them off, right? And they stopped giving, or something else happened. It's a life event. Maybe there's a death in the family, joblessness. There's something happening that might be a ministry opportunity. So can you then go find out who are the touch points for that person? Are they on a volunteer team? Maybe the volunteer team leader can reach out, or are they in a small group, right? So those are the types of things that you could use analysis and data recognition to figure out how do we translate into ministry outcomes to really up the game. And then the last one is just improvement, because it's trained on millions and millions of data points of language that's already been written out there on the internet, in databases, etc. It could take best practices of communications and improve, whether it's logic of your content and arguments in your pieces, coming up with discussion questions based on it that actually trigger really thoughtful discussions, reframing things for different audiences, because it understands how to talk to different audiences, even though you might not be writing for, say, a youth audience on a typical basis. Well, it's trained on tons and tons of content that's aimed at that audience. It knows how to write better to that audience than you, how to reframe it for a skeptic or someone that has just had the believer's prayer and just started to go to church. There's all these things that you can help to improve content. So I think those are the big buckets: communications, research, strategic analysis, and then improving your content are four, I think, good ways to think about, practically speaking, how we could use that at church.
So those are really good ways for church leaders to think through the application of it. Talk about a little bit of the why. Why are they using this? Is it about saving time? You know, is there something deeper than just saving time here? Like, what are some of the actual outcomes or results that you're seeing, maybe even in your own Facebook community, where there's a lot of activity that I see on a pretty regular basis? What are some of the outcomes or results that you've been hearing about?
Yeah, I think there's many reasons, right? It's because it's not just one persona of a pastor or a church leader. There are definitely people that are looking for, how do I make what I do stronger, more impactful, more strategic? And how do I take advantage of what's been out there, right? It's almost like you have a mentor that's sitting over your shoulder, helping you with what you're doing in your work. And so that's one category. There's obviously the other side of the spectrum, people that are looking for shortcuts, that people are trying to figure out, how do I get away with doing less and just, still representing that I'm showing up to work every day. And then there's everyone in the middle, right? Mm-hmm. Where saving time, productivity is obviously something that everyone tends to be interested in. How do I get more stuff done faster, quicker, better? So there's the middle also. But I think our responsibility as leaders in all of our communities is really to shepherd our people to say, hey, we need to really embrace a growth-minded posture and really look at this and how do we amplify what we have, our superpowers, what our secret sauce is in what we bring to the ministry, what God has gifted us in doing. How do we amplify that and have scale that impact so that we can actually help more people in what we're called to do as a church?
Yeah, for me, one of the reasons I quickly started engaging was just the ability to accomplish things that make my preaching better. And not just in preaching, but for example, if I got a sermon, I got a message, I've written it out. One of the hardest things is I want to find illustrations that help these things to stick. And back in the day, probably before you guys were around, there was this thing called the Encyclopedia of 7,700 Illustrations. It was by a guy named Paul Leaton. And, you kind of look up by topic, and then eventually they moved these things online. I had a quick verse product that was a Bible illustration program. Because, good illustrations can really make a sermon amazing. Now I basically can say, here's my message. What illustrations might you suggest that I could use? And there are great historical illustrations, all of which you have to check for veracity.
Yes.
Don't be that person who gets up and shares a hallucination from AI as your sermon illustration. But again, the test that I do, and this is a test I've always done. Matter of fact, it's a test I tell my students to do. My students will say to me, how much help can I use from somewhere else? And what I explain to them is kind of the in my case, the wife test. I say, if I could ask my wife, hey, honey, could you gather some books and some resources for me to then digest and to decide where they fit and how they work? And she does that. I think that's fine. So and she's sharing the load. I want AI to share in the load for pastors. I love bivocational pastors having the ability to access resources where not, I mean, can imagine big church pastors have a research assistant who spends all his or her time looking for great illustrations, but so do you. But just keep in mind with all the cautions and the caveats that we're using here today in discussing this as well. All right, we're getting near the close of our time, but what are some mistakes? I'll ask both of you, Kenny and then Steele. What are some mistakes people use using tools like ChatGPT, Bard, and others?
Again, it's that inclination to see it as a shortcut. I think that's the number one thing. I think the other mistake.
But let me ask you, because I'm sort of like advocating. I mean, it is making your research faster. Is that what you mean by a shortcut? Because I think that's probably I'm positive towards that.
No, I'm talking about. I think it's pushing it to the extreme where you're just dialing it in, right? Like saying, hey, I don't need to spend 20 hours on my sermon this week, right? If I typically spend 12, 15, 20 hours, now I can dial it in 3 hours.
Yeah,
right?
amazing though. If you took the time, let ChatGPT help you do some of the research, and then took the time to hone it, to study God's word, to bathe in it, to pray. Okay, I got what you mean.
And the notion there, Ed, is generative AI really doesn't bring down the cost of quality content, right? It's not like the wrong way to think about it is a push button vending machine. That's a single button you push, out comes this candy wrapped in this shiny foil, and you can just open it up and consume it as is. It actually takes time to work with AI. It's called a conversational chatbot for a reason. The best way to use it is to have a conversation, iterate with it as a conversation partner, as a research assistant, as a seminary student intern, so that you can actually build something that's stronger. So the cost of quality content actually isn't being drastically reduced. What is being drastically reduced is the quality of the production of mediocre content, junk content.
That's good.
Right? The cost of junk content is basically going down to zero, but the cost of quality content is effectively staying the same. And so that's just one of those things that most people don't understand immediately. I think after you get through a learning curve, you're going to start to understand that. It's almost as if I'm reliving the cycle of social media. When social media first came out, all these church leaders just thought, hey, social media is free. We don't have to do ads anymore. In fact, we don't need to hire a professional. We just need some youth kid that I can pay with pizza for free, and then that will solve all our social media stuff, and we'll get all the benefits, right? That has been a large mentality about digital. And so that's one of those things that I think it's the same cycle of thinking and posture that will evolve over time, but we're just not there that with everybody.
Good. So still, I want you to give us a mistake, but I want to tell you just for fun, just while we're sitting here, I typed in suggest traditional hymns to sing on Pentecost Sunday. I got 10 hymns. So I mean, I think one of the things you have to remember is that ChatGPT is brilliant, but has the maybe receiving capacity of a 4-year-old. So if you can actually communicate in such a way that you're asking the question specifically, with hard to misunderstand, it goes really, really well. So I got, in case I want to sing traditional hymns on Pentecost Sunday, I've got 10 of them, and I'd say 8 of them are right on. I wouldn't have thought of them. It just generates ideas for me. But still, back to mistakes. What mistakes would you say folks need to make? Need to make?
I think even just your example just there is, it inspires your thinking, right?
Yep, great way to put it.
Even your questions about your Francis Chan interview, you're not taking those questions verbatim, right? Even though you said you used 2 of them, my guess is you didn't read them scriptively off of the page. These things should inspire a church leader or a pastor when you're in the middle of creating content or whatever it is you're trying to achieve. Maybe it's you're trying to drive strategy at the church, and so you're just asking questions of ChatGPT. Treat ChatGPT or other AI tools like that these are called generative AI tools, pastors and church leaders. And so use it to inspire you. I saw an example where somebody posted a photo of someone who just copied and pasted a response from ChatGPT, and they claimed it as their own. They did not, they didn't use that transparency that you talked about earlier. And they included in their copy and paste the canned message from ChatGPT as an AI model. This is the extent of the research I can do for you. Dang. They forgot to leave that part out. And so, those are some common mistakes, is that you use it verbatim as it gives you. Keep in mind, guys, in this idea of artificial intelligence, in the age that we are currently in, the moment that we are currently in around artificial intelligence, most people believe that this is the infancy stage of artificial intelligence. And so you'd be copying and pasting a baby's response to one of your questions. Don't do that, pastors. Really take it and use it as inspiration and maybe as a basis that leads to more exploration or more of your own personalization.
Yeah.
It's a good word. If you're watching via video, most of you listen on the podcast. We also have a video version on YouTube. You're watching via video, you see I'm sort of in my office, and I got books on my desk. There's Ruth Haley Barton's book, and this is a James Merritt book, and this is an Alice Matagora book, and they just happen to be here. And the way I like to think of it is that AI gives me the opportunity to have all these open at the same time, looking at options, but then I've got to process these things. If you're a pastor and a church leader, not everyone's a pastor and church leader who listens, but if you're a pastor and church leader, people in your church are assuming and you're on the team to be the person who wrestles with things. And wrestles requires more than AI, but AI can be the tool helps bring, like even I have these books here, it brings them closer to me, gives me easier accessibility to what's in them to then be more effective in ministry. So again, fascinating conversation. I want to encourage you to go to glue.us/AI. We've got an upcoming hackathon, which sounds nefarious, but it's not. Kenny's a part of it. I'll be there, a part of it. And we're going to be talking about some issues. And Steele, of course, will be there. He's facilitating it. Also, too, we have all the AI in the Church Hub. I've already mentioned some of Kenny's resources, which will also be all linked from the AI in the Church Hub, which is at glue.us/AI. Dip your toes in the water. Do it with discernment, wisdom, but ultimately good stewardship so that the name and fame of Jesus will be more widely known.
You've been hearing from Kenny Jahng. You can learn more about his work at AI4ChurchLeaders.com. And thanks again for listening to the Stetzer Church Leaders Podcast. You can find more interviews as well as other great content from ministry leaders at ChurchLeaders.com/podcasts. And again, if you found our conversation today helpful, we'd love for you to take a few moments to leave us a review. That'll help other ministry leaders find us and benefit from our content. Thanks for listening. We'll see you in the next episode.